Hello, class. This is our last recording, Zechariah chapter 14. And the title of this message is The Deliverance and Exaltation of the Lord's People. The time of Jacob's trouble, as described by the prophet Jeremiah, is the same period of time that the New Testament writers describe as the Tribulation. We see in verse 1 of chapter 14 of Zechariah, he writes, "Behold, a day is coming for the Lord when the spoil taken from you will be divided among you. For I will gather all the nations against Jerusalem to battle, and the city will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half the city exiled, but the rest of the people will not be cut off from the city." The pivotal concern of chapter 14 is to show that the Lord comes on behalf of his covenant people in order to complete all the purposes for which he had elected, redeemed, and preserved them. The restoration of Israel will not come until all the forces of evil that seek to subvert Israel are put down once and for all. The nations of the whole earth will come against Jerusalem, and having defeated her, will divide up the spoil of war. That's in these first two verses. It is important to note that it is the Lord who gathers to nations, for his design is not only to purify his people in tribulation, and we saw that back in chapter 13, verses 8 and 9 of Zechariah, but to provide an occasion for the destruction of her enemies. Zechariah clearly states that Jerusalem will be captured, the houses plundered, the women ravished, and half the city exiled. But the Lord will deliver his people. Let's read verses 3 and 4. "Then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, which is in front of Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley, so that half the Mount of Olives will move toward the north and the other half toward the south." The effect of the Lord's coming is not only victory for his people, we see in verse 3, but also the establishment of his earthly kingdom, which is toward the end of the chapter, verses 9 through 11. The Lord will go forth and fight against those nations, we see here, like he did in the Old Testament. The scene is that of the armies of the nations invading and surrounding Jerusalem. These armies will pour into the Kidron Valley between Mount Zion, where the temple is located, and the Mount of Olives, which is to the east of that. What separates these two mounts is the Kidron Valley. When the Lord comes in that day, his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives on the east of Jerusalem. When this happens, the Mount of Olives will be split in its middle from east to west by a very large valley. The splitting of the Mount of Olives creates a new valley, one that is on an east-west axis. The newly created valley becomes an escape route. Look at verse 5. He says, "You will flee by the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains will reach to Azal. Yes, you will flee just as you fled before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord, my God, will come, and all the holy ones with him." Thus, the great valley that emerges from the splitting of the Mount of Olives becomes an escape route for the remainder of Jerusalem's population that was not exiled. That's the other half, the half that remained. The Israelites will flee the city through the Lord's valley, through the mountains, and go as far as Azal. Zechariah compares the urgency of the flight to that which attended the escape from the earthquake in the days of King Uzziah. Eugene Merrill indicates that recent research at Hazor gives evidence of such a seismic that earthquake, such a seismic event in 760 BC, one that must have been so significant as to provide a point of reference for Zechariah 250 years later. The prophet now interjects. Zechariah says, "Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him." It is the Lord with his celestial armies that Zechariah sees. We see this will be a unique day unlike any other day. We see in verse 6, "In that day there will be no light, the luminaries will dwindle. For it will be a unique day, which is known to the Lord, neither day nor night, but it will come about that at evening time there will be light." The prophet Zechariah declares that there will be no light in that day. The luminaries will dwindle. Thus, the luminaries of heaven will become clouded over, thickened, or congealed, so that their light will not shine forth. This phenomena will occur in a unique day, one unlike any other, and in that it will have no day or night. That is, it will not be divided up into the usual cycles of light and darkness. Instead, everything will be reversed, so that in the evening, when darkness is expected, there will be daylight. Metaphorically, this could mean the end of the period of tribulation and judgment for the Lord's covenant people. The Lord will be king over all the earth. Let's read verses 8 and 9. "And in that day living waters will flow out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the eastern sea, the other half toward the western sea. It will be in summer as well as winter. And the Lord will be king over all the earth. In that day the Lord will be the only one, and his name the only one." In prophetic literature, living waters is used as a metaphor for the Lord's blessing, or even for the Lord himself. Most instructive in understanding the function of these living waters is Ezekiel chapter 47. Virtually all scholars agree that chapters 40 through 48 in Ezekiel's prophecy is millennial. It is a vision of a glorious day yet to come. So it seems both Ezekiel and Zechariah are anticipating the millennial reign of the Lord on earth and the rebuilding of a new temple in which the Lord will dwell among his people. Both prophets, Zechariah and Ezekiel, are looking at the imagery of millennial refreshment that attends the presence and power of the Lord as he will be king over all the earth. John's apocalypse describes the same glorious vision in Revelation 22 verses 1 through 5. Most significant is that John, just like Zechariah, John connects this living stream with the reigning of the Lord through his redeemed ones. Security of the Lord's covenant people. Let's read verses 10 and 11. "All the land will be changed into a plain from Geba to Rimmon, south of Jerusalem. But Jerusalem will rise and remain on its site from Benjamin's gate as far as the place of the first gate to the corner gate, and from the tower of Hananel to the king's wine presses. People will live in it, and there will no longer be a curse, for Jerusalem will dwell in security." In the Lord's earthly kingdom, Jerusalem will continue to be the center from which will radiate the grace of God to all the earth. To express this centrality, Zechariah visualizes the leveling of the Holy Land and the elevation of Jerusalem so that the city stands high above, overlooking the surrounding terrain from a position of eminence and security. Within the confines described in verse 10 here. People will once more occupy Jerusalem. We see that in verse 11. No longer will there be a fear of a curse, because people will live in Jerusalem in peace and safety during the reign of the Lord, that is, the Lord Jesus Christ, who is the Messiah. Victory over the enemies of the Lord's people. Verses 12 and 13. Now this will be the plague with which the Lord will strike all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet. Their eyes will rot in their sockets. Their tongue will rot in their mouth. It will come about in that day that a great panic from the Lord will fall on them, and they will seize one another's hand, and the hand of one will be lifted against the hand of another. In contrast to the absence of a curse upon the Lord's covenant people is the infliction of plague upon all the peoples who have gone to war against Jerusalem. Here in Zechariah, the plague attacks both man and animal, completely disabling them. The effects of the plague is that their flesh will rot while they stand on their feet, and their eyes will rot in their sockets, and their tongue will rot in their mouth. The suddenness with which this occurs certainly indicates the Lord's judgment will be instantaneous in its administration. The Lord will also send confusion among the warring nations. A great panic from the Lord will fall on them, and they will seize one another's hand, and the hand of one will be lifted against the hand of another. God's people will complete the defeat of the nations that the Lord has already begun. Verse 14 and 15. 14 says, Judah also will fight at Jerusalem, and the wealth of all the surrounding nations will be gathered, gold and silver and garments in great abundance. So also like this plague will be the plague on the horse, the mule, the camel, the donkey, and all the cattle that will be in those camps. The context here makes it clear that Judah is joined with Jerusalem in battle, probably in or near the city. Thus the battle narrative here then is a continuation of the one already described in connection with the escape of God's people through the valley, open to them as described in verses 4 through 8 that preceded this in this chapter. Having thoroughly frustrated the enemy nations, the Lord will lead his people back to the battlefield, where they will complete the defeat the Lord has already begun. Once this is done, the enormous wealth of the surrounding nations will be gathered up as the spoils of war. Note, the same plague that disabled the warriors in verse 13 will also disable their horses, mules, camels, donkeys, and all the cattle in their camps. Here we see Jerusalem becomes a center of pilgrimage. We see that in 16 and 17. Then it will come about that any who are left of all the nations that went against Jerusalem will go up from year to year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to celebrate the Feast of Booths. And it will be that whichever of the families of the earth does not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. The last section, verses 16 through 21, describes the worship of the King, the Lord of hosts, and the observance of the Feast of Booths. Those who are left over from the conflict of verses 12 through 15 must now come to bow before the King, the Lord of hosts, and render signs of their submission. This is precisely the picture in Isaiah chapter 60, verses 4 through 14. The wealth of the nations will come, and they will bring tribute to the altar of the King, of the Lord. Kings will serve him, bowing down before him, and calling Jerusalem the city of the Lord, the Zion of the Holy One of Israel. The yearly occasion of pilgrimage is the Feast of Tabernacles. The prophet states that all who fail to go up to Jerusalem to acknowledge the sovereignty of the Lord will suffer the absence of rain. We see that in verse 17. Thus the vassal who withholds his tribute may expect the great king to withhold the means of its production of the tribute. The Lord will punish any who fail to celebrate the Feast of Booths. If the family of Egypt does not go up or enter, then no rain will fall on them. It will be the plague with which the Lord smites the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. This will be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all the nations who do not go up to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Egypt is particularly singled out as being accountable for worship and subject to judgment if they fail to go up to Jerusalem to celebrate the Feast of Booths. Why Egypt? Unlike many nations, Egypt is gifted with an ample water supply, that is, the Nile River. Thus, this makes them less dependent on seasonal rains. Perhaps the Lord is saying that not even Egypt, with her secure water supply, is immune to the drought. The Lord could stop the torrential rains that feed the Nile River in the mountains of Africa. Thus, the warning to Egypt would be a warning against any nation thinking it might avoid the divine judgment of drought. The unclean and the godless have no place in the Lord's kingdom. Let's look at verses 20 and 21. In that day there will be inscribed on the bells of the horses, Holy to the Lord. And the cooking pots in the Lord's house would be like the bowls before the altar. Every cooking pot in Jerusalem and in Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts, and all who sacrifice will come and take of them and boil in them. And there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts in that day. Zechariah's prophecy closes by emphasizing the holiness of the Lord's kingdom. Even the bells of the horses will be inscribed holy to the Lord. Every cooking pot in Jerusalem and Judah will be holy to the Lord of hosts. They will be like bowls before the altar. No longer will there be a distinction between the secular and the sacred. And there will no longer be a Canaanite in the house of the Lord of hosts in that day. The phrase suggests that the unclean and the godless will have no place in the future kingdom of the Lord, our Lord Jesus Christ, the Messiah. And that concludes this study of the book of Zechariah.